We've got some fresh new young talent doing some things that I know you haven't heard before.
1, 2, 3, listen.
Welcome to Finances, your home for all things financial, investment, money and lifestyle. Hosted and curated by the very talented team of certified financial planners at Burke Britton Financial Partners. This is episode number 101 of the Finances podcast. Today joined by our resident aged care expert. Am I allowed to say that, Delta?
Sure.
Yeah, let's do it. I think you're the most well-versed in this practice, including Peter. Who comes third? Ben doesn't know anything about aged care, does he? He's a farmer boy. All right, so when we're talking about sort of aged care, a lot of the focus historically has been on the person actually entering aged care. But one of the things that's, I suppose, forgotten is actually the children of that person that are generally making the decisions about how they enter aged care. Most of the burden of decision-making lies with the kids thereof. So what I thought we'd do today is actually run through a little bit of a Q&A around some of the key considerations for kids of parents or elders that are actually heading into aged care and some of those decision points. Now, I want to make a reference back to some of our previous podcasts. We've talked, I think episode number 6, Peter and I went into a deep dive of sort of the aged care system, what a RAD is, what a DAP is, daily accommodation costs. So we'll link that into the show notes. Anyone wants to go back to that and have a listen. I think today, let's start with a couple of relatively sort of softball questions around aged care. So the first one is, are mum and dad going to have to sell their family home for them to enter aged care?
That's a great question, Jay, and I suppose the answer to most of today's questions will be it depends.
You know why it's a great question? Because you wrote it down for me to ask you.
So when we talk about aged care, there are a lot of financial implications of decisions that are made, but also, there's a lot of emotion involved in these decisions. So we like to be in a position where we can have a detached view and try and guide families on making the most appropriate decisions for today and future implications.
You seem like you're dodging the question, Delta. The people are going to have to sell their family home to enter into care.
Well, the simple answer is no, Jay. They don't have to. So it depends on whether or not there's a person that will remain residing in the home. If we were talking about mum and dad both still being around, dad's entering care and mum is remaining in the home is not an assessed asset. If it's just dad that's still here and he enters aged care, then the home will have an assessable asset value, which is capped for a 2-year period.
It's funny answering it depends. It feels a bit trite and sort of evasive sometimes, but it's the reality of the situation is that it depends in most instances. There's not a very clear cut about whether someone needs to sell their asset or sell their property to move into care. Next question, do I have to fund mum and dad's costs with a big lump sum? So that's, I suppose, one of the biggest concerns for people. I'm going to have to find, or mum and dad are going to have to find a lump sum because I've seen some of the cost for aged care accommodation deposits. Do I have to fund it with a big lump sum?
Again, the answer is it depends. It depends on a number of different factors. Aged care here in Australia is means tested, so that depends on what assets mum and dad have available to them to support their own cost of care.
Is that it?
I think so. It just depends how much detail we go into.
All right, next one. Is it a good idea for me to pay the aged care bond or RAD? I'm assuming that is it a good idea for me as the child, my parents, to actually fund that for them if they can't get that together themselves?
Yeah, so what I'd say in that respect, Jay, is that if me as the child decide to pay that RAD, the refundable accommodation deposit, for mum or for dad, that I need to be aware that that would actually be refunded to mum or dad's estate. Now, what are the implications of that? Perhaps I've got a family dynamic whereby I don't have a relationship with some of my siblings. I need to be aware that that asset will become part of mum or dad's estate and be distributed as per their wishes.
So, practical example, I decide to pay for mum's aged care. That refundable accommodation deposit comes back into mum's estate, and a sibling that I don't like or maybe wants to take issue with mum's estate potentially gets those funds. So they're not coming back directly to me, are they?
Correct. Mum's estate might even say give it to the Lost Dogs Home, local charities, whatever mum's estate might be drawn up as. So generally, that wouldn't be a path that we would take.
So next one is, how will they fund it? So let's think about some of the accommodation deposits. We've seen them anywhere from sort of $300,000 if you live in sort of Toorak or something like that. You might have accommodation deposits of $1.5 million. How will that be funded? That's probably the biggest concern for most people and for their parents, is how they're actually going to fund the move into aged care.
Yeah, again, given aged care is means tested, it depends on the accessible assets that mum and dad have available. We may be in a position where there is no requirement for mum or dad to pay. That accommodation cost is either a lump sum or as an ongoing amount. So it really comes down to seeking advice in the structuring of assets to try and reduce and influence the fee costs that are applicable.
I know everyone's different, but how do you see people actually fund it? What are some of the options that you see people doing to actually fund that deposit, whether it be $500,000, $800,000? How do they do it?
Yep. So it depends on the type of investments that they might have available. It might be made up with some cash holdings. It might be redemption of other investments. It could be superannuation pensions. Again, it really depends on the need to pay either a lump sum or an ongoing cost.
Got it. Well, I think we've probably answered this already, but do all aged care facilities charge the same amount? I think I said before that they don't, but what's the reason that they charge different amounts?
Yep. So aged care facilities can charge different amounts depending on their location, depending on the room and the accommodation that's offered. So, you might be looking at a room that doesn't have an ensuite, for example, versus a deluxe room that has an ensuite and a view over, a park or a beach or those types of things. So that sets the accommodation contribution. And each aged care facility can also have in place additional services which are set by that particular facility for each resident to pay. And generally those are not optional. And, we've seen recent examples of those being sort of $10 a day. So again, it's just a consideration when selecting the right facility.
All right, next question, Delta. There's another depends answer already, but when should we think about aged care? I know the answer is that it depends.
Before we need it?
Yeah, but when is the best time, and what are some of the triggers that we're seeing most people start to think about aged care for their parents, or parents themselves think about their partner or themselves?
Yeah, so there's a few different trigger events. On occasion this will be with the loss of mum or dad, and then considering whether or not the survivor or the widower can remain in the family home on their own. And again, our advice is always it's better to be having these conversations sooner rather than later. So if there's any concerns around mum or dad's ability to remain at home independently, I'd be having those conversations as soon as possible.
Okay. The assessment for care needs. So the Aged Care Australia process, what's in place to actually get assessed, and what exactly does that look like?
Yeah, so the assessment involves understanding what care needs the particular person or persons might require, and then based on that, it can dictate whether or not the person maybe, for example, is eligible for some home care assistance. So that's the step prior to entering aged care, or whether or not their needs dictate that aged care might be the most appropriate place for them to live, considering any support that they might have at home.
So just to be clear, does someone need to have an assessment before they can actually go into aged care?
That's a great question, Jay. Yes, is my understanding they do to determine, again, their level of care needs.
Yeah, it's interesting because the idea sometimes retirement villages get confused with aged care. Maybe let's talk about some of those distinctions and the transition for people from their own home, care in the home, to supported living, retirement living, aged care. What's the difference between all of those? What's available for people as they move into sort of the latter years of their life?
Yeah, so retirement style villages or lifestyle villages are generally just independent living, but within a community. That facility will normally, or that community will provide things like pools, gyms, bowling rinks. So really that's around entering those types of living arrangements when you are young enough, let's say, to make full use of the facilities that are available. Sometimes there might be, a nurse that's on call, for example, but it's simply independent living in a lifestyle type village. So then there's the next step around, if you have an assessment and it's determined that you need some additional care at home, That might be via a home care package. So again, that's the step before entering aged care. You remain in your own home, but support services are brought in. It's also means tested. So again, comes down to income and assets that you have available to fund those things yourself. And then the third sort of point there is residential aged care. So you've entered residential aged care and you intend to remain as a permanent resident in that facility for the entirety of your foreseeable future.
Here's a question, Delta. How long are people waiting to get services in the home once they get assessed? Because this might speak to when you should actually be seeking support for your parents or for yourself. How long does it actually take once you've got assessed to actually get that assessment completed and the services provided?
Yeah, so there's 4 different levels. So there's levels 1 through to 4, 4 being the highest need. So if you're looking at something like a level 3 assessment, you might be waiting 6 to 12 months to actually get services at home. So it's a pretty poor reflection of the infrastructure that we have in place to support people remain at home. And it's clearly something that the government is going to need to address given the ageing population that we have.
Yeah, I think the feedback that we've received is that the time frame can take so long that by the time people get it, they're actually not then capable of actually being in home. They might be then moving into residential aged care, which again speaks to as soon as you can, start to have these conversations with your parents, with your spouse, and at least work out what's actually going to be most suitable for you. Because if you leave it too long, sometimes the door shuts on your ability to take advantage of those services.
Yeah, you could say the same too, Jay. We've got a number of examples within the practice of where we've got clients as a couple. One is choosing to care for their loved one at home, and unfortunately it gets to a point in time where that's no longer manageable for them. So we attempt to have proactive conversations and really give them some insight into what it might look like from a financial viewpoint if they choose to make that difficult decision to have their loved one into care. You need to be in a position where you have the ability to care for yourself, of course, before you can continue caring for loved ones. So that might potentially just be some respite.
Now, I'm not sure whether I mentioned it earlier, but the forecasts indicate that over $3.5 trillion in assets is to be transferred from Australian baby boomers. They're the people that are moving into sort of aged care and aged services at the moment, to their heirs over the next 2 decades. Next question. In this transfer of wealth that is ultimately going to happen, can mum and dad gift some of their assets, some of their proceeds of their home or some of their assets to their kids while they're still here? And what sort of implications does that have on their aged care assessments? How does that work?
Well, to answer your question, yes, they can, but it does have implications. And, we're conscious of that happening more and more, especially with debt levels that exist in Australia with property prices and so on. So it's something that we're seeing a lot more of. From an implication point of view, so let's say, my mum and dad decide to provide me with an early inheritance to support me with, some debt or something else that I might like to do. If mum and dad were to give me $50,000, for example, that would still be assessed as an asset in mum and dad's hand for a period of 5 years. So yes, it's okay to support children. Often, encourage there is support for children, but we have to understand the implications from an assessment point of view. So it remains accessible with us for 5 years.
I think that's a really important part, thinking about some of the implications of people moving into the latter parts of their life. One of the big concerns is we talk about elder abuse, the potential for people to have
conflict.
That's what I'm trying to say. Yeah, have conflict or people take advantage of parents who maybe have significant degrees of wealth. One of the things that we've encouraged our clients to do is to have more family group discussions and actually bring in, and again, this conversation around aged care is really targeted at not necessarily those people moving into aged care. It's targeted at their children. So the likes of yourself and myself in our 40s thinking we're concerned about mum and dad. We want to make sure that they've got the support that they require. But importantly, there's some decisions that from an estate planning point of view and also from a power of attorney point of view that are important. What are the key things from an estate planning point of view that people now need to have in place for their parents and understanding as a part of their family group to make this transition as seamless as it possibly can be?
Yeah, so probably first step in that process would be actually ensuring that a power of attorney has been appointed to make those decisions, whether they be lifestyle, financial or medical. The person that makes the appointment has to actually have capacity. So let's say, for example, Mum or dad's health has deteriorated and unfortunately they have a dementia diagnosis, it would be unlikely that they would have capacity at that point in time to select the person or persons they want to act for them. So again, we encourage all of our clients to be proactive and be prepared. Choose your power of attorney now whilst you have capacity, and appoint a person that you trust to be making those decisions. So whether that be your spouse, for example, or your spouse plus your children. So that's first and foremost, because you want to have someone that can make those decisions for you, who you've selected if you don't have capacity to do so. And I was just going to say, and then the next step from that would be wills. So having actually wills that are documented, they would stand from a legal viewpoint. Again, they would appoint the executors, the people that would step in and implement our wishes if we were no longer here. When we talk about estate planning, I always like to reiterate that estate planning starts with how the asset is actually held. So the ownership of particular assets dictates whether or not that is an asset that would form part of the estate. So that's probably a very early consideration when we're looking at discussions around who might own assets.
If you want to listen a little bit more on estate planning, go back to episode number 27. We had Daniela Pavlovic on, and I think we talked specifically about the importance of that, not only for in this situation, but in anyone's situation. So in closing, Delta, is there anything else, any other sort of top tips for kids who are worried about their parents and they want to get them organised so that they're not left with a dire situation or challenging decisions when it's time for parents to move into aged care or get support?
Yeah, I'd say seek advice, have conversations early, proactively with siblings, with mum, dad, whomever the relevant key people are, to have clarity around mum and dad's wishes, and then seek advice around how we might structure assets and things if mum or dad is to enter care. Just to touch on a point we just discussed earlier, there's a lot of innovative products around aged care now because there's certainly a growing demand for it within the Australian market. So again, all of these things tie into how are the assets structured, what's the estate planning, what are the implications if mum or dad are no longer with us with those proceeds. We want everyone to have a really clear understanding. If they make this decision, this is the implication that it will have. And if that's what's intended, that's great. But sometimes it's an unintended consequence. So we want to be guiding people to make the appropriate decisions.
Beautiful. I was just looking at a stat there, Delta, that those over 85 that tend to be the main users of aged care services, their numbers are expected to increase at least fourfold by 2047. Fourfold. So it's an unbelievable increase. And you think about all the implications of that to those family members. That's why this next 2 decades, if you're thinking about your parents and how you support them, it's so important that you actually start to have these conversations early and you get the right support around them and yourself so that you can actively make great decisions. Anything else in closing, Delta?
Probably it for today.
If anyone wants to talk to us or yourself about aged care, how do they get a hold of us?
So on Instagram, Facebook, TikTok, our website, burkebritain.com.au. Follow us on Spotify with the podcast series, or simply give the office a call.
Beautiful. Thanks, Delta.
Thanks, Jay.
We hope you enjoyed today's episode. If you're keen to understand more about how financial advice could benefit you, follow us on Instagram, Facebook and Twitter at BurkeBritain.FP, or Google Burke Britain Financial Partners. Check out our client reviews, testimonials, and make a time to meet one of our certified financial planners by clicking Book Now on our website. Thanks for listening.
Any information contained in this podcast is of a general nature only. No account was taken as to the objectives, financial situation, or needs of any particular person. Therefore, before making any decision, listeners should consider the appropriateness of any information with regard to their particular objective, financial situation, needs, and seek independent advice from a licensed professional specific to their circumstances.
All right, hit it.
That translates to don't be a moron and act on what some random person says on a podcast. Take personal responsibility, do your homework, ask questions, and speak to an actual human that knows what they're talking about before you do anything. PB Financial Solutions Proprietary Limited, trading as Burke Britain Financial Partners, are authorised representatives of AMP Financial Planning Limited, AFS, licence number 232706.